Harriet Beecher Stowe was a daughter of New England who became one of the most influential writers in American history through a single powerful novel. Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author whose words helped ignite a nation toward civil war, was born in Litchfield, Connecticut on June 14, 1811. She came from a prominent religious family. She had a brilliant mind and a passionate spirit. Stowe's upbringing was steeped in theological debate and moral conviction. She was educated at her sister's school, the Hartford Female Seminary, where she excelled in composition and languages. Then in 1832, her family moved to Cincinnati, Ohio, and the 21-year-old Harriet followed them to this border city where slavery was just across the river in Kentucky. Harriet Beecher Stowe witnessed slavery firsthand in Cincinnati. She saw the human cost of the institution. In 1836, Harriet married Calvin Stowe, a widowed theology professor at Lane Seminary where her father was president. Calvin, along with his modest income, meant Harriet had to work to support their growing family. Stowe began writing stories and essays for magazines and journals. She started to develop her voice as a writer, crafting narratives that explored moral questions and social issues. America felt that slavery, this peculiar institution, was tearing at the fabric of the nation and creating a moral crisis that could not be ignored. Harriet Beecher Stowe was not a radical abolitionist or a William Lloyd Garrison or a Frederick Douglass, any of the fervent activists, if you will, who were leading the anti-slavery movement. She was a more reluctant convert. In 1850, Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act, which required citizens to assist in capturing escaped slaves. 1 year later, Stowe began writing what would become Uncle Tom's Cabin. Harriet was literally the woman at her writing desk who sat down with pen and paper ready to tell a story that would shake the conscience of a nation. In June 1851, the first installment of Uncle Tom's Cabin appeared in the anti-slavery newspaper The National Era. The story was serialized over 10 months. But within weeks of its publication as a book in March 1852, Uncle Tom's Cabin became a sensation. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote a novel that touched hearts and changed minds. She used storytelling, narrative power, and emotional truth to make readers see enslaved people as human beings with families and feelings and dignity. Stowe sold 300,000 copies in the first year in America alone. Uncle Tom's Cabin was the best-selling novel of the 19th century and the second best-selling book after the Bible. Stowe's strategy was all about making people feel the reality of slavery. Uncle Tom's Cabin told the story of Uncle Tom, an enslaved man of deep Christian faith who is sold away from his family. The novel followed Tom through multiple owners, showing both the cruelty and the humanity within the slave system. Stowe created unforgettable characters like Eliza, the mother who escapes across the frozen Ohio River clutching her child, and Simon Legree, the brutal plantation owner who becomes the embodiment of slavery's evil. She showed the separation of families, the violence, the sexual exploitation, and the dehumanization that were inherent to slavery. The book sparked enormous controversy. Harriet Beecher Stowe was attacked by Southern writers and politicians who claimed she had misrepresented slavery. They said she didn't know what she was writing about, that she had never lived in the South, that she was spreading lies and propaganda. Stowe responded by publishing A Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1853, a book that documented the real cases and sources that had inspired her novel. She proved that every incident in her book was based on actual events and testimonies. Uncle Tom's Cabin had an extraordinary impact on public opinion about slavery. The novel was translated into dozens of languages and read around the world. It was adapted for the stage, and theatrical productions toured throughout the North, bringing the story to people who couldn't read or couldn't afford books. The play became one of the most performed productions in American theater history. In Britain and Europe, the book turned public opinion against the American South and made foreign intervention on behalf of the Confederacy politically impossible during the Civil War. Harriet Beecher Stowe became an international celebrity. She traveled to Europe 3 times, meeting with royalty, intellectuals, and reformers. In Britain, she was greeted by massive crowds and received petitions signed by hundreds of thousands of women expressing solidarity with the anti-slavery cause. Stowe used her fame to continue advocating for abolition and to support her family through her writing income. She wrote prolifically, producing novels, essays, and articles on various social issues. The legend says that when Abraham Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe in 1862, he greeted her by saying, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war." Whether Lincoln actually said those words is debated by historians, but the sentiment captures the widespread belief that Uncle Tom's Cabin had helped bring about the Civil War. Stowe's novel had crystallized Northern opposition to slavery and made compromise increasingly difficult. It had personalized the abstract political debates about states' rights and property by showing slavery as a human tragedy. During the Civil War, Harriet Beecher Stowe continued to write and advocate for the Union cause. She supported the recruitment of black soldiers and called for complete emancipation. When Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, Stowe celebrated it as a fulfillment of the moral vision she had articulated in her novel. She saw the war as a divine judgment on the sin of slavery, a belief shared by many in the North who interpreted the conflict in religious terms. After the war ended in 1865, Stowe turned her attention to other social issues and continued her literary career. She wrote novels about New England life, drawing on her Connecticut childhood and her observations of changing American society. She explored themes of religion, domesticity, women's roles, and social reform. Her novel The Minister's Wooing examined Calvinist theology and its impact on ordinary people. Old Town Folks depicted small-town New England life with humor and affection. She also wrote Lady Byron Vindicated, defending the poet Lord Byron's widow against accusations, though this book damaged Stowe's reputation because of its scandalous revelations about Byron's personal life. Harriet Beecher Stowe was part of a remarkable family of reformers and intellectuals. Her father, Lyman Beecher, was one of the most prominent Protestant ministers in America. Her brother, Henry Ward Beecher, became perhaps the most famous preacher of his generation, leading Plymouth Church in Brooklyn and speaking out against slavery. Her sister, Catherine Beecher, was an educator and writer who advocated for women's education and domestic science. The Beecher family represented the moral and intellectual energy of 19th-century American Protestantism. Stowe's personal life was marked by both joy and tragedy. She and Calvin had 7 children, but they lost their infant son Samuel to cholera in 1849. This devastating loss deepened Stowe's empathy for enslaved mothers who had their children torn from them. She later wrote that she could understand something of the anguish of slave mothers because of her own grief. Her son Frederick, a Civil War veteran, struggled with alcoholism and disappeared during a voyage to San Francisco, never to be seen again. These personal sorrows informed Stowe's writing and her understanding of human suffering. In her later years, Harriet Beecher Stowe settled in Hartford, Connecticut, and also maintained a winter home in Mandarin, Florida. She continued to write and remained active in literary and social circles. Mark Twain was her neighbor in Hartford, and they became friends despite their very different literary styles and sensibilities. Stowe's final years were marked by declining mental faculties, and she gradually withdrew from public life. She spent her last years in quiet domesticity, cared for by her family. Harriet Beecher Stowe died on July 1, 1896, in Hartford, Connecticut. She was 85 years old. Her funeral was attended by family, friends, and admirers who recognized her as one of the most important American writers of the century. The tributes emphasized her role in the anti-slavery movement and her contribution to American literature. Newspapers across the country published obituaries celebrating her life and legacy. Stowe's legacy is complex and multifaceted. Uncle Tom's Cabin remains one of the most influential novels in American history, a book that demonstrated the power of literature to shape political consciousness and drive social change. The novel helped make slavery a moral issue that could not be compromised away. It gave faces and stories to people who had been treated as property. It mobilized anti-slavery sentiment in the North and created international pressure on the United States to end slavery. However, Uncle Tom's Cabin has also been criticized for its racial stereotypes and its portrayal of black characters. The character of Uncle Tom, meant by Stowe to represent Christian virtue and moral strength, became in later popular culture a term of derision, suggesting servility and accommodation to white supremacy. This transformation of Uncle Tom's meaning shows how cultural interpretation can change over time. Modern scholars debate whether Stowe's novel, despite its anti-slavery message, reinforced certain racist assumptions about black inferiority and the need for white guidance. The theatrical adaptations of Uncle Tom's Cabin, which proliferated after Stowe's death and continued into the 20th century, often distorted her original story. These productions, known as Tom shows, frequently emphasized melodrama and spectacle while downplaying the novel's anti-slavery message. Some versions even portrayed slavery in a positive light. These adaptations contributed to the negative connotations that became attached to the Uncle Tom character. Stowe had no control over these theatrical productions and received no royalties from them due to the absence of international copyright protection. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin from the perspective of 19th-century evangelical Christianity. She believed that slavery was a sin against God and that Christian love and moral suasion could overcome it. Her novel appealed to readers' religious sentiments and their sense of Christian duty. This religious framework was both the source of the novel's power and a limitation. Stowe could not imagine a society of racial equality. Instead, she initially supported colonization schemes that would send freed slaves to Africa. Her vision of emancipation was constrained by the racial assumptions of her time. Despite these limitations, Stowe's achievement remains remarkable. She was a woman writer in an era when women's voices were often dismissed or marginalized. She used the tools available to her, the sentimental novel and the language of Christian morality, to intervene in the most pressing political crisis of her time. She demonstrated that domestic fiction, often derided as trivial women's writing, could have profound political consequences. Uncle Tom's Cabin showed that stories about families, homes, and personal relationships could illuminate large social and political questions. Stowe's other writings have received less attention than Uncle Tom's Cabin, but they reveal the breadth of her interests and talents. Her New England novels are valuable portraits of a particular time and place in American history. Her essays on domestic economy and household management contributed to the 19th century cult of domesticity that elevated women's roles as wives and mothers. Her religious writings explored theological questions and the relationship between faith and daily life. She was a versatile and prolific writer who supported her family through her pen for decades. The question of Stowe's relationship to feminism is complicated. She believed in women's moral superiority and their special role as guardians of home and family. She advocated for women's education and women's influence in society. But she did not support women's suffrage or challenge the fundamental gender hierarchies of her time. She worked within the ideology of separate spheres, arguing that women's domestic influence could be a force for social reform. Modern feminists have debated whether Stowe's work advanced or hindered women's equality. Harriet Beecher Stowe understood that for social change to happen, hearts had to be changed as well as laws. She believed in the power of sympathy and emotional connection to overcome prejudice and injustice. Uncle Tom's Cabin was designed to make readers weep, to make them feel the humanity of enslaved people, to make them see slavery as a personal moral issue rather than an abstract political question. This strategy of appealing to emotion and sentiment has been both praised and criticized. Some see it as a powerful tool for social reform, others see it as manipulative and paternalistic. The publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852 came at a critical moment in American history. The Compromise of 1850 had attempted to resolve the conflict between slave and free states, but the Fugitive Slave Act had inflamed Northern opinion. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 would further destabilize the political situation by allowing territories to decide the slavery question through popular sovereignty. The Dred Scott decision of 1857 would declare that black people had no rights that white people were bound to respect. Against this backdrop of escalating crisis, Stowe's novel provided a moral framework for understanding slavery as an unmitigated evil that had to be abolished. Stowe's religious faith was central to her identity and her work. She grew up in a household dominated by theological discussion and religious intensity. Her father's Calvinism emphasized human sinfulness and divine sovereignty. Harriet struggled with these doctrines, finding them harsh and unforgiving. She eventually embraced a more liberal theology that emphasized God's love and human free will. This religious evolution is reflected in her novels, which often critique rigid Calvinism while affirming Christian faith. Her belief that slavery was a sin gave her writing moral authority and urgency. The economic success of Uncle Tom's Cabin transformed Stowe's life. Before the novel, she had struggled financially, writing magazine pieces for small payments while raising children and managing a household. After the novel, she was wealthy and famous. The money allowed her to travel, to educate her children, and to live comfortably. But it also brought pressures and expectations. She was now a public figure whose opinions were sought on various issues. She had to navigate the demands of celebrity while continuing to write and maintain her family life. Harriet Beecher Stowe's relationship with Frederick Douglass and other black abolitionists was respectful but complicated. Douglass praised Uncle Tom's Cabin for its anti-slavery impact but also criticized its portrayal of black characters and its suggestion that colonization might be a solution to racial problems. Stowe met with Douglass and other black leaders, and she modified some of her views over time. She came to support full citizenship rights for freed slaves and opposed colonization schemes. But she never fully escaped the racial paternalism of her era. The impact of Uncle Tom's Cabin extended far beyond the United States. In Britain, the novel became a bestseller and influenced public opinion against slavery and later against the Confederacy during the Civil War. British working-class readers identified with the enslaved characters and saw parallels between their own exploitation and that of American slaves. In Europe, the novel was read as an indictment of American hypocrisy and brutality. In Russia, Tolstoy admired the book and was influenced by its moral vision. The novel became a global phenomenon, shaping international perceptions of America and slavery. Stowe's writing style in Uncle Tom's Cabin combined sentimentalism, realism, and melodrama. She used detailed descriptions of domestic life to create a sense of authenticity. She employed emotional appeals and dramatic scenes to engage readers' feelings. She included dialect and vernacular speech to give her characters distinctive voices. She interspersed her narrative with direct addresses to the reader, making moral arguments and appeals. This mixture of techniques made the novel accessible to a wide audience while conveying its serious message. The character of Uncle Tom himself represents Stowe's ideal of Christian virtue. Tom is patient, forgiving, and faithful even in the face of terrible suffering. He refuses to betray other slaves or to compromise his principles. He maintains his dignity and his faith until his death. Stowe intended Tom to be a heroic figure, a black Christ who redeems through his suffering. But this portrayal has been controversial. Some see Tom as too passive, too accepting of his oppression. Others argue that Stowe was working within the limits of what her white audience could accept and that she was trying to counter racist stereotypes of black violence and savagery. Harriet Beecher Stowe lived through enormous changes in American society. She was born when slavery was legal throughout the South and accepted by many in the North. She died when slavery had been abolished for 3 decades but when Jim Crow segregation and racial violence were creating a new system of oppression. She witnessed the transformation of America from a rural, agricultural society to an urban, industrial nation. She saw the rise of women's rights movements, labor movements, and progressive reform efforts. Her long life spanned much of the 19th century and its tumultuous social changes. Stowe's home in Hartford, now a museum, preserves her memory and her contributions to American literature and history. Visitors can see where she lived and worked, where she wrote her later novels and entertained friends and family. The house stands as a testament to her achievements and her place in American culture. It reminds us that literature can be a force for social change and that individual voices can make a difference in history. When Harriet Beecher Stowe died, she left behind a body of work that included novels, essays, sketches, and articles. She left behind a family that carried on her legacy of social engagement and moral conviction. Most importantly, she left behind Uncle Tom's Cabin, a novel that had helped end slavery and that continues to be read, studied, and debated. So Stowe was even in death the woman whose words had changed history.